Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
The theme of our discussion is to talk about 20 years of Iraq War. March 20th was the week which marked the 20 years of the US invasion of Iraq. Before we begin, let me quickly give a quick bio of you, sir, for our viewers and audience. Jonathan Landay is the US national security correspondent for Reuters and has written about foreign affairs, international security, defense, intelligence for more than 3 decades. Major events that he has covered include the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, the wars of former Yugoslavia, September 11, 2001 attacks of 9/11, the 2001 US-led invasion of Afghanistan, and the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, the civil war in Syria and the Islamic State of insurgency in Iraq and Syria, and so on and so forth. So this is an excellent bio, sir, and thank you so much for the service you have done to the people of the United States and absolutely to the world of journalism. And thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
So to begin with, so let us dive right in. 20 years back, the world witnessed American troops rolling into Iraq, and the prerequisite or the rationale that set the onset of this invasion was that the Bush administration's claim of Saddam Hussein possessing weapons of mass destruction, maintaining a nuclear weapons program, and his close ties with Al Qaeda. Everyone in Washington was perhaps singing along this tune of the president's policy, and no one as such came forward. No mainstream media, no mainstream network came forward with any sort of question. And of course, there was a public discourse going along with this. The narrative was that people were very angry and they wanted to see some action. So, of course, there was no questions asked. And at that moment, what exactly you found so triggering? Like, what exactly you found something so sketchy that made you stand against this and made you question the government's decision to invade Iraq?
So let me just say that I was part of a team. My team consisted of Warren Strobel, our editor, John Walcott, and later on the late Joe Galloway, who was co-author of We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And it began with on September 12th, 2001, when Warren came back to the Bureau and called me into John's office and said, I've just been told that the discussions at the White House about the attacks of 9/11 went beyond discussions of Afghanistan, but also to discussions of Iraq. And we couldn't understand why they were talking about Iraq, because there was no link between the 9/11 hijackers and Iraq. We knew that the 9/11 that Bin Laden, Al Qaeda, was based in Afghanistan, and that, as I said, there was no apparent connections to Iraq. And from there, we started noticing that a lot of supporters of the administration, people who were very close to senior officials, they started this drumbeat on how, well, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda could not have done this attack all by themselves. It was too sophisticated, it required too much planning, and therefore a state had to be involved. And then eventually we started hearing, well, that state has got to be Iraq. There's no other state that could do this. And to us, that made no sense whatsoever, because Saddam Hussein was a secular dictator of the kind, exactly the kind of despot in the Middle East that Al Qaeda was targeting for ouster. This extremist Sunni Muslim uh, organization wanted to get rid of Arab dictators like Saddam Hussein. And it also made no sense. And the other part of the Bush administration's case for war was that Saddam had resurrected these weapons of mass destruction programs, and that there was this danger that he could give weapons of mass destruction to Al Qaeda. And that made no sense either, simply because Iraq was under a microscope of both the UN weapons inspectors, who eventually Saddam kicked out, but spy satellites and all the other high-tech means that the United States and other countries use to gather intelligence on other countries. And we were being asked, the American public, the world was being asked to accept the notion that despite all of this very intrusive monitoring that was going on, that somehow Saddam was able to avoid all of that and reconstitute his chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. That made no sense. And then again, as I said, it made no sense that Saddam would take the crown jewels of his military force and give them to an extremist like Osama bin Laden, who could turn around and use them against Saddam. So that made no sense either. And from there, we just started doing the reporting, and it took us where we went, which was none of this, that this was all based on bogus and exaggerated and cherry-picked intelligence. And some of it I wouldn't even call intelligence. It was just information that was fed both to the Bush administration and to outfits like the New York Times by a man named Ahmad Chalabi, who was the leader of the Iraqi National Congress, sort of the main opposition, if you would, force, a main opposition, Arab opposition to Saddam, because don't forget that the Kurds had been fighting Saddam. And I determined through a lot of my reporting that this information was bogus, or it was exaggerated, or it was cherry-picked.
Indeed, a lot of these mainstream media publications were picking information from the leader of the Iraqi National Congress, who and moving forward, I was there at the Cato Institute when you spoke about this in that first panel, and you also mentioned that you offered predictions and forecasts that what might happen if this invasion unfolds, that there will be a sectarian violence, there will be sort of communal violence, there will be a rise of sort of a civil war. A lot of rationale that has been also used while justifying this war was the analogy being drawn from the Rwandan genocide. During that time, people said that the United States inaction during that period led to a massacre of close to like a million Rwandans in less than 100 days during that civil war. So would you think that Saddam Hussein, a person who has literally no regard for human lives, who was butchering Kurds, used chemical and biological weapons during Iran war as well, and on his own people, could set the onset of another such a massacre? So wouldn't that this analogy make sense to remove Saddam Hussein?
What, to prevent him from committing a Rwanda style?
Yes, again.
He had already used, as you pointed out, chemical weapons against his own people, the Iraqi Kurds. He had used them in the 8-year war against Iran. And you would have to accept that he still had them to use, right? And that was the whole crux. The fact is that there were UN weapons inspectors who were in there in Iraq for years until he threw them out. But they found nothing, or they found remnants. And in fact, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamal, defected to Jordan in the run-up to the war and submitted himself to interviews with the weapons inspectors. And that interview, the transcript was available to me. The UN, the IAEA put all of the these and the UN weapons inspectors put most of their materials online, available to anyone who wanted to go look at them. And in that interview, Hussein Kamal said, "We got rid of it all. It's all gone. We don't have any more. Now, by the way, if you go to my chicken farm, you'll find all of the documentation we hid on the biological weapons programs." And that's exactly what happened. They found that documentation in his chicken farm. And he was telling the truth. They had gotten rid of all of their weapons of mass destruction. To be able to enrich uranium, they would have had to have built a major facility or facilities in which to install tens of thousands of these machines called centrifuges, in order that are used to purify uranium into highly enriched uranium fuel for nuclear warheads. Well, there was no evidence at all that such a facility or facilities existed. There just wasn't. And we were being asked by the Bush administration to basically ignore all of that.
Well, thank you. So I was sitting with Barbara Slavin yesterday, and I told her that I have an interview with you, Mr. Jananthan. And she told me, who's also a very distinguished journalist, a very serious senior journalist who has worked on Middle East for more than 30 years. She told that you actually did take a lot of heat for the kind of work you were doing in Washington during those years, which went absolutely against the crowd. And we also saw in the visuals in the movie Shock and Awe, in which Woody Harrelson was playing your character, that I think it was a scene from a barbecue, that you actually took questions and criticism from your own family members, from your own relatives, from your own friends.
That was Warren's father.
Exactly, yeah. So if you could just walk us through that journey of yours, what kind of personal heat, what were the personal costs that you actually took up, and what were the other things that you actually took up against yourself because of the work you were doing?
The thing is that it was very lonely because we were really the only ones who were writing those stories. But there was no social media back then. You know, the internet was still kind of in its infancy. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. And so a lot of people just, didn't read our stuff. And plus the administration did not pay any attention to us because it would have given us the best advertising we could have asked for. There were people who were reading our stories, and we were getting some vicious emails. And unbeknownst to us, the president of Knight Ridder, the CEO, Tony Ridder, was getting flack from advertisers, but he had our backs. He would have none of it. He said they're journalists, and when they write stories, you'll know it when I know it. And so, as far as taking a lot of heat, I did take heat from some U.S. officials. Like, I was called into the offices of several senior Pentagon people who proceeded to yell at me and accuse me of false reporting. But that's so yeah, I did take some heat, but it wasn't the kind of heat people take now, like on Twitter, when you get reactions to, people can hundreds of people, thousands can react to your stories on Twitter, and that we weren't getting that kind of heat.
What kind of impact would that have had if 2003, the kind of social media environment and the kind of the criticism and the parody, as well as the bullying sort of goes on social media? What kind of impact would that have had on the onset of invasion?
I mean, that's a question I can't answer. I certainly, it would have had a bigger impact in terms of our stories reaching more eyeballs. That absolutely, and perhaps that could have gotten more people, more journalists to do what we were doing, and may have forced the administration to answer the questions that were raised by our stories. But for the most part, but we'll never know. We'll never know to what extent a full court press by all of the U.S. media, or most of the U.S. media, on the administration's case for war, what that would have had, what impact that would have had. Would it have persuaded Bush to call off the invasion? That's a question never going to be answered.
That's right. I mean, I completely second that, because the kind of criticism that goes on social media actually puts a lot of impact on the administration's decision. Moving forward, talking about the policy that went down with Bush administration's intervention into Iraq, a lot of people say that they were trying to copy the model of Afghanistan intervention, that overthrowing the Taliban government without any opposition, with a very small opposition of a very rural insurgency-based kind of an opposition, and installing the Northern Alliance-led leaders, forming a pro-Western democratic government. People say that Iraq model was pretty much based on the same sort of blueprint, but not knowing the fact that Saddam Hussein's military was more organized, more cohesive. They had the Royal Guard as well. They had special forces as well, and there was no the opposition lacked the kind of power that wanted to be put in power. So. Would you think that the administration's idea of copy pasting Afghanistan policy into Iraq, what kind of challenges that might have added on to that, if that is
No,
true?
I disagree completely with that viewpoint. Let's not forget, this was the second war that the United States had fought against the Iraqis. They knew
Exactly,
exactly
yeah.
up against. They knew exactly the kind of formations they were up against and the terrain they were up against. And so, no, I mean, it was there was no way that Saddam was going to be able to resist an American led invasion. His military just simply was unable to cope with that. Even his vaunted Republican Guard. And so, no, it was a different kind of invasion, completely different kind of invasion. Let's not forget, in Afghanistan, most of what the Americans did was use of air power, right? There were special forces on the ground, but the United States, everybody fails to realize, had 50,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan. Only they didn't belong to the United States. They were the Northern Alliance. And so they had Northern Alliance ground forces in combination with U.S. Special Forces and U.S. air power. And that is very different from what happened in Iraq.
And what, according to your analysis, sparked the sectarian civil war that happened between Sunnis and the Shias? Was it because of the de-Baathification process that was taking place?
Oh,
Was it
no.
because of the
I mean, because Saddam is, he was minority Sunni,
right?
kept that country under his thumb by force. And once you took him and removed him and his security forces, you took the top off this pressure cooker, where the Shia and the Kurds had been repressed for years and abused for years. And so it was inevitable that this rivalry along both ethnic and religious lines was going to explode. And that's exactly what happened.
The United States has no policy whatsoever to deal with this kind of insurgency coming out.
There was, and I wrote this, there were numerous warnings to the administration from various parts of the government that this is exactly what could happen. But those assessments were never read and digested in the White House.
Well, very interesting, because it also leads us to the part where it created a security vacuum, a kind of security vacuum where non-state actors found their footing, such as the AQI Al-Qaeda of the Iraq branch, which was led by Musab al-Zarqawi, which later formed into the ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So I was reading this paper by Audrey Kurtz-Cronin, where she clearly, bluntly attributes the rise of Islamic State, the rise of Caliphate, to the US policy of Iraq invasion. So would you also second that? Would you also go along the similar line of your analysis?
Oh, absolutely. Because so Zarqawi made his way across from Afghanistan across Iran into northern Iraq. And I actually was covering him before the war, before the invasion. When I was I spent the first 4 months before the invasion in northern Iraq, and he was there with a Kurdish Islamist group called Ansar al-Islam. And yes, definitely, the American invasion took the lid off a lot of things, including the Sunni Shia tensions in Iraq. But also, let's not forget that the people who formed ISIS, who started ISIS, because Zarqawi started Al Qaeda in Iraq, right? And the people who insurgents and former Iraqi army officers who were arrested and jailed by the Americans. That's where in the prison is where they formed ISIS, where they all met, radicalized, and well, they were already radicalized, but met each other and formed this group. It was definitely a direct consequence of the American invasion.
And what followed after the de-Baathification process was there's a huge chunk of young Sunni Muslims who were left nothing but to be radicalized. And did the potential Islamic State operatives or the leaders find that as a as a breeding ground? Did they capitalize on that kind of vulnerability among the people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is where the rank and file came from, right? This is where their foot soldiers came from. The de-Baathification basically deprived. Let's not forget, if you were a school teacher, if you were some kind of professional, you joined the Ba'ath Party to reap the benefits because you got additional benefits by being a member of that party. But it didn't mean that you were a hardcore supporter of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. It just meant that you were joining because that was a way to better take care of your family, right? But then when people like that were removed from their jobs, teachers and ordinary soldiers, policemen, of course, this led to this increased their dissatisfaction. They were unemployed. They couldn't, they were having problems taking care of their families. They felt like they were then discriminated against because they had been in charge. And yes, so that created this sentiment that fed ISIS recruitment.
Right. And the second element that I want to bring in about the security vacuum is that another major effect in the security vacuum conversation is that Iran seems to have gained a lot of influence in the region. The conventional wisdom holds till date that Iraq is a client state of Iran, and it is a natural ally given the population of Shias living on the both sides. And Iran being a natural ally and ethnic kin of Iraq, and Qasem Soleimani was Iraq's favorite. So, how would you say that the US invasion of Iraq laid the groundwork for Iran to step in, gain a presence, achieve a sort of a strategic depth in the region, and perhaps build on the political and the security vacuum that was created by United States presence?
So I was in northern Iraq when an Iranian trained Iraqi Shia militia came marching across the border and into Iraq to fight Saddam. I don't think you could call Iraq a client state. I think that's what Iran hoped to turn it into, because don't forget, the Iranians underwent enormous amount of suffering during that 8-year war that Saddam waged against them, and so they had a great deal of apprehension of allowing a U.S. government to run Iraq, because the U.S. is also they view United States as a foe as well. So what they did was they used these militias, these Shia political parties, to gain both political power and to enforce that political power. But there's been a backlash in Iraq against Iranian influence, and we've seen massive,
2019 protests of students. Exactly.
massive anti-Iranian demonstrations take place, particularly in Basra in the south. And so, no, Iraq is not a client state. But does Iran still continue to wield enormous influence? Yes, through these militias, which, don't forget, were brought in and made official parts of the government, the Interior Ministry, right? And so these guys are still around. So the Iranians can still exert influence through them and through other Shia politicians.
Indeed. Right. And if you look at Iraq today, we also see that the basic understanding also says that it stands for everything against the American interest. We see Iran's influence, as we just touched upon, Iran's proxy militias and non-state militias maintaining sort of strong influence on the Iraqi leadership. Its proxy forces targeting American interests in the region. And Iraq is exactly the place where China, from the last few years, was negotiating a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We just saw the visuals of the reapproachment that happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was negotiated by no other than China. So, what sort of pictures that we see today is that Iraq has become a center where all sorts of United States rivals meet, interact, and foment and materialize their relationships against America. So, what sort of strategic gains is the United States still trying to extract, given that they maintain 1,500 active U.S. troops in the country? What kind of strategic depth?
I think the United States welcomes this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because it promises to bring more stability. It brings the closure to. Could bring, because we still don't know where this rapprochement is going to go, but it has the potential to bring to an end, or at least ease, the fiercest regional rivalry in the Gulf. And so I think the United States welcomes that. The United States would welcome the Saudi Arabia developing the ability to help secure its own security without having to rely totally on the United States. And so I don't think that this is something that the United States looks down on. Let's not forget that the way the United States views the world right now, China is seen as the biggest competitor, followed by Russia. Iran certainly is up there, mostly because of its nuclear program and the potential of that program to be able to produce weapons. But when it comes to where the United States is policy-wise, again, I think that that it would welcome this rapprochement. Yes, China was involved, but China got involved at the last moment. Let's not forget, Iran and the Saudis had been talking in Oman and in Iraq for more than a year. And it needed the Chinese to, I mean, the way the United States sees it is the Saudis needed the Chinese to come in because they wielded influence with Iran that the United States doesn't wield, right? And we're still not sure what the upshot of all of this rapprochement is going to be. We're told that it includes an end to Iranian arms supplies to the Houthis in Yemen, where the Saudis have been fighting since, I think, 2015. But we haven't seen a cutoff of those supplies yet. We haven't seen the Houthis agree to return to political negotiations on a settlement to this terrible war. And so that's all remains to be seen. It's a work in progress.
Yes, exactly. We want this relationship. We want this kind of a peace deal to be visible on the ground in Yemen as well. It's an important part. It has become an important battleground between both these great power competition. So, would you also say that this can be seen as an event in which China is stepping up its game in the Middle East? China is trying to become a bigger power in the Middle East and kind of producing a counterweight to American influence in the Middle East.
Oh, sure. Of course. The only question is to what extent and how hard will China exert itself? Is China in a position to provide security guarantees or a security alliance with the Saudis? No, that remains the United States. And I'm not sure that the Chinese want to do, get involved in a relationship like that. The Chinese have been building military bases in South Asia. We've seen in Gwadar and in Pakistan, and then in Sri Lanka, and
CPEC, BRI, yeah.
and the bases on disputed islands and atolls in the South China Sea. But I don't know, and certainly they want to wield political and economic influence as strong as they possibly can. They have got a lot of money to be able to invest in Saudis. They need oil too. But to what extent this will confirm China as a major player in the security of the region is yet to be seen. There's no Chinese troops. Certainly, I believe the Chinese have built their only overseas base in on the Horn of Africa. But as far as being a regional security player, I don't see that at this point.
Since we have talked about, you also spoke about Afghanistan in the previous section. I was also reading about this foreign affairs article written by your colleague John Walcott, and he clearly mentioned about the fault lines of US policy in Afghanistan. We stayed there for 20 years. We stayed there and we did everything we could stop from Taliban to coming in power. We established a regime. We backed the Afghan National Forces and the defense services for more than 2 decades. We were involved in counterterrorism operations targeting ISIS-K and ASI and whatnot, and still we saw what happened after the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. In fact, before that, the Taliban was successfully able to recapture. What went wrong in that particular zone of earth?
I mean, you got a couple of hours?
I wish the kind of discussion we don't get to see more often and have more often.
Went wrong, and it started before the American invasion of Afghanistan. It began in 1992 when the U.S.-backed Mujahideen overran Kabul and took power, and the United States promptly packed up and turned away and walked away after pumping $3 billion of weapons into Afghanistan instead of staying and helping to rebuild and helping to the various factions to navigate their way into a cohesive government. The United States turned around. We saw absolute chaos and violence shake the entire country, and that's what gave rise to the Taliban. It was a spontaneous movement against the warlordism that had erupted and carved up Afghanistan, basically. And so that was the first mistake. The second mistake was to create a strong central government with in a country that had never had a strong central government with a central police force. The United States kind of imposed that on Afghanistan and empowered various governments to use this new power that they had never had before to wield, and instead of going back to a system where power was diffused among the various actors in various parts of the country, which is what it was under the former Afghan monarchy, which dispensed money but dispensed patronage too. If you were a village elder, your son got into the military, your first son got into the military, your second son went to university and got a job as a public official, et cetera, et cetera. That system kept the peace in Afghanistan for decades. So, and then the other serious problem was the fact that the United States spurned an offer of negotiation with the remnants of the Taliban and refused to allow them to participate in the Bonn Peace Conference and give them a role, give them an investment in peace in Afghanistan. And had they done that, who knows? And then finally, I mean, there are a lot of other of problems that we could go into, errors that the United States made. Right. But then the biggest one, of course, was the invasion of Iraq, which forced the United States to divert troops and time and resources, money, attention to a second war in a second Muslim country. And, the most basic fundamental tenet of military strategy is not to have to fight on two fronts. And the United States ended up in fighting in two fronts. It focused on Iraq and made Afghanistan a economy of force operation, as the military will call it. In other words, doing as much as they could with the minimum amount of troops, because all the other troops were in Iraq. So there are many reasons why this went upside down. Plus, everybody blames the United States, and the United States carries some blame, but so must Pakistan. Oh, yes. Pakistan continued backing the Taliban, even as it professed unity with the United States. It was still backing the ISI, and the military was still backing the Taliban, because they still saw Afghanistan as a place that they would use as their strategic backyard in case there was a war with India. So they continued to do that. And then there were many other, I mean, the Afghan leaders themselves, the corruption, the refusal to forge unity across ethnic lines, the dependence on foreign powers as sponsors. I mean, on and on and on one can go in pointing out why Afghanistan was a failure. Afghanistan was a success in one sense, however, and that was that for the United States presence, the presence of the U.S. and its partners provided a 20-year window respite in which large numbers, more unprecedented numbers of young Afghans, women and men, were able to go to school and able to go to university and able to travel and able to learn sets of values that they had never been part of Afghan culture before. Of the good side of democracy and a democratic system and free press and human rights activism, et cetera, et cetera. They gained from that 20-year window that provided by the U.S. and its allies in ways that Afghanistan has never profited before. And perhaps one day these people will come back to their country, those who have left the country, and perhaps rebuild it.
I mean, I spent a fair amount of time in Afghanistan, and I saw the amount of hard work which has emerged out of this country, the kind of civil society that developed, the kind of development that has happened, the kind of democratic values that have been held upon. And yes, and the free press, great leaders, young leaders advocating for all sorts of human rights organizations, taking up leadership roles. Exactly.
Organizations, human rights organizations.
Yes.
Society organizations, on and on. Mm-hmm. These are groups, these are values that had never been in Afghanistan before. And I don't know that you can reverse that now. These young people have tasted the freedoms that were afforded them over those 20 years. And that's why you see these young women in the street protesting against the ban on women going to school.
Right. And I mean, in a sense, it can be said that the gains have been reversed because all the kind of policies that the Taliban has put into place, banning women from working in NGOs, going to offices, and going to school. Here and also in Washington, D.C., when I meet my friend from the civil society and activist groups, and perhaps the former members of parliament, I meet them, and they have some sense of disappointment with the government as well, with the United States government as well, with the kind of evacuation they carried out, with the kind of careless withdrawal they carried out, it indeed left a huge chunk of people vulnerable, exposed, and completely unsettled in Afghanistan. So there is a great sense of disappointment within Afghanistan as well. So you said that the kind of resources, energy, money we shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq, and the cost was $2 trillion of treasure, more than 4,000 US forces KIA, and over 300,000 Iraqi lives lost. And the question that follows is, can this sort of thing happen again? Can leaders of the country go based on manipulated intelligence, deceive the whole world into going to war? Can this kind of thing happen again?
Sure, why not? Of course. Yes, he could. Hopefully it won't. But let's not forget, this is not the first time that the United States has gone to war based on false pretenses. The United States entered the war in Vietnam through this bogus attack that the government claimed was made by the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, on an American warship in the Gulf of Tonkin, which never happened. But that was used to justify the U.S. intervention in the Indochina War. And so it's happened before.
Do we hope to see any accountability?
Yeah, so it could happen again. Yes.
Do we hope to see any accountability to that?
As a journalist, that's what I do. I hold people accountable. It's up to others, the Congress and the executive branch and human rights organizations to go further. I do my accountability with my journal.
As we have come to the last section of our interview here, just have two very small questions. The first would be, given the cost that we just talked about associated with the Iraq War, now looking at 20 years after the Iraq War, the question is, would there be more Iraqis alive today had Saddam would still be in power?
Oh, I can't answer that. I have no idea. He might have gotten into another war. Who knows? Right. I don't. I can't say. I can't answer that question.
Many in the audience, sir, would be emerging journalists and students who hope to make a career into journalism. And the kind of story that you have told us indeed talks about a lot about independent journalism and your seniors who possess extremely great editorial leadership with their work and the kind of sense of transparency that you have shown throughout 3 decades. So what would be your message to these young people who work in extraordinary circumstances, who work under scenes of surveillance, who work under due pressure from the government to change the narrative or to build a new narrative or to not show the real narrative? What kind of message would you like to send to them?
I mean, it's hard for me to give advice to people who are working in systems where the repression of the press is official government policy, because doing so puts their lives at risk, right? So right. I'm rather hesitant to give them advice because it could get them in trouble. Young journalists in Western democratic or other democratic societies, they have the ability to practice journalism, and they should do it properly. They should do it well sourced. They should do it with determination and vigor and energy, and not be dissuaded by how tough it can be. It's not an easy thing to do what Warren and John and Joe and I did. It was not easy at all. But it was basic journalism. Remain true to the ethos of journalism, which is checks and balances on government abuse, and to hold government and other people accountable, and do your best. It's hard for me to say more than that.
I think those are like great words of wisdom, and I'm sure our guest and our viewers and listeners will take a lot from your work and the message you have just sent. Well, thank you, Mr. Landay, for giving this interview and for being with us. I hope your work continue to inspire a lot of next generation of journalists and writers as well. Thank you so much.